I think it'd be good to get us started because we don't have a lot of time. So I'd love to get us kicked off and start with an introduction, a quick one of my friend Bryan, who I am just really excited to be able to introduce to all of you. This has been a really fun little series that we're doing, and Bryan is our third speaker, following two excellent presentations from Michelle Schulte, who I'm glad to see is on here, as well as Eric Hemingway, who spent a couple of really interesting sessions with us. Bryan's going to bring us a different perspective as tribal chairman and a tribal attorney, and a really solid advocate that we've been working with quite a bit on Line 5. So Bryan has a lot of different things to offer us. And I am really, I think rather than me giving his intro, I'm going to let Bryan do that for you all, and just welcome Bryan. Thanks for being here, and y'all give him a little whatever finger wave or whatever we do on Zoom.
Well, Ani Bijou, it's I'm really excited to be here, and Michelle, it's good to see you on here too. I'm not going to bore you all with my background, but I was too much. I was born and raised here in Bay Mills Indian community. The top hand, right here on the Canadian border, just west of Sault Ste. Marie. We're along the lakeshore here on Lake Superior. And finally, it was delayed, but we finally got winter. And so I grew up here. I went to Michigan State University for undergrad. Go Green.
Go Green.
I went to MSU College of Law for law school. Go White. And so I'm a double Spartan. And after law school, I spent a little bit of time at the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C., in President Obama's administration. Moved back to Michigan because why not, right? And this is our home. And I was living in Lansing, with a legal practice with a friend of mine, working with tribes across the country, and then got myself elected as tribal judge. And my wife and I realized we were both working remotely, so why would we live in Lansing when we are both from Bay Mills? No disrespect to those of you who are from Lansing. We loved our decade there, but Lake Superior is something else. So we moved home. And then in 2017, I was elected as tribal chairperson here for Bay Mills, and I've been doing that ever since. So that's a little bit about me. And I'm happy to answer more questions. I'm also a miserable, absolutely miserable, self-loathing Detroit Lions fan. And my suffering is a huge part of my identity. So that's a little bit more about me.
I like the tiger hat though.
Yeah. Well, my hair is a little bushy. I used to keep it long, and I had it cut a little over a year ago. So I'm growing it back, but while I'm keeping that under control, I thought I'd represent.
Nice.
So as a recovering attorney, and I used to teach Indian law at MSU Law School. That's kind of my orientation and my bent. And so I just want to explain a little bit for you guys, kind of how we arrived here at 2020 with relations between tribes and the federal government and the state and local communities, and kind of what that means, the legal structure of it all, and not spend a whole lot of time on that. And then really just have a roundtable discussion. I think these things often go best if people have their curiosity satisfied. And I will tell you up front, because I really believe in the power of dialogue, that if you have a question that you're just a little hesitant to ask because you're wondering how it might come off or what it might mean, I encourage you to ask it, because I would rather you get the answer you want than carry around that question with you and your assumptions. So please don't be shy about that and worry about my reactions, because I want to have a dialogue and find an understanding. So, right, we all went to high school and middle school, I think, and we got the story of Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and the founding of the United States with the chopping down the cherry tree and all that good stuff. Our history in North America is far more complex than that. And, it started out with colonial powers competing, European colonial powers competing for what they viewed as a resource-rich land. And so a lot of our laws around Indian tribes have very little to do at their core with treating Indian people well, and more to do with settling legal arguments over property between Britain, France, and Spain, and Portugal. So we have these colonial powers showing up here in North America, wanting timber, wanting furs, wanting gold. And, they had wars with each other on this continent. And one of the things that they had to do was settle who really has a right to colonize this area of the continent. And so they came up with this legal doctrine called the Doctrine of Discovery. And this is like, if you think of the American legal system as a giant oak tree, the Doctrine of Discovery is the acorn from which it sprouted. All right, so the Doctrine of Discovery says, well, this continent in North America was devoid of civilization. Forget that you have millions of people here. They're not Christian, and they don't count. And so the people who have a real valid legal claim to this territory do so by discovering it under the authority of Christianity. And so that Doctrine of Discovery, we discovered you, we have a right to your land, is really the foundation for property law in this country. And what that doctrine means is basically, as I said, if I show up at Jim's house, I say, I've discovered this house. Under the Doctrine of Discovery, I have claimed the right to acquire it from Jim at any price we can negotiate, no matter if the bargain occurs with me holding a gun to Jim's head or just taking his house while he's out for a walk. But nobody else has a right to purchase this house, only me. All right, so we fast forward from this competition amongst colonial powers, and we get to the American Revolution, and we got these agitating colonies forming their own government. And then as they're engaged in war with Britain, they decide, you know what, things aren't going so well, we could use some allies. And so the colonies form these alliances with tribes up and down the East Coast, military alliance. And as part of this, they signed treaties. And one of the very first treaties that the United States signed was a treaty with the Delaware Tribe, which, as you may have guessed, is from the Delaware area. This was a treaty of military alliance and political alliance. And basically, if the colonies said, hey, Delaware Tribe, if you help us against the British and you provide us support, we will recognize you. We will give you representation as a state in our new Congress. And basically, it looks like, if you go back and read that treaty, it looks like a bilateral treaty negotiated by equal powers. And then we have the US Constitution that was formed. And you guys may know we have three branches of government. Sometimes it only seems like we have one, but we actually have three. And the first branch of government we have mentioned in our Constitution is Congress, the People's Branch. And one of the very first powers that the colonies gave to the United States Congress in our Constitution was the authority to regulate commerce among the states, so regulate interstate business, regulate business with foreign nations. So what we have are Congress assuming control over relationships with the sovereign states and sovereign foreign governments. But then if you go to Article 1 Section 3 of the Constitution, you'll notice something interesting. Along with those two sovereigns, you'll see that the colonies granted Congress the authority to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes. So the United States Constitution recognizes three separate types of sovereigns explicitly: state governments, foreign countries, and Indian tribes. So people say, often ask, where do tribes get off thinking these guys are sovereigns? Well, first of all, we always had that power to govern ourselves. But George Washington and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson recognized it. So, if it's good enough for them, it should be good enough for most people in the American legal system. In addition, in the Constitution, later on, the states granted to the federal government the ability to make treaties. And in doing so, the Constitution says that treaties are the supreme law of the land. They trump any state law, they trump any state court decision, they trump any local ordinance. Now, how does that impact Indian law and Indian tribes? Well, in the process of acquiring land from tribes, the federal government had to do it in an orderly way, a legal way. And the most common way they did that was through treaties. And so you have hundreds of these agreements between tribes and the United States government that were really intended, they were purchase agreements more or less. But there are all kinds of promises there that were made in those treaties. And the US Constitution recognizes that Congress has a power to relate to tribes, that tribes are sovereign, and that treaties are the supreme law of the land. So that's, you see how we get from the Doctrine of Discovery to here. This was all intended to be an orderly process to acquire Indian lands. So for many decades after the founding of the United States, the country negotiated hundreds of treaties with tribes. Here in Michigan, in 1836, the most famous treaty that we have is the 1836 Treaty of Washington. How many of you guys know when Michigan became a state? What year?
1855, right?
1837.
37. Oh, right.
So you say, well, geez, what's going on in 1836 and 1837? Well, you have this treaty that takes, I'm going to pull out my handy dandy Michigan map. You have this treaty that takes, if you draw a line from Alpena to the mouth of the Grand River, everywhere north of that, in the UP, everything east of Escanaba and Marquette, our tribes ceded to the United States in that treaty of 1836. And it was that treaty that gave Michigan, which at that point was a territory, the geographic continuity it needed to become a state, which happened the next year in 1837. So it was that treaty between the Ojibwe and Odawa tribes here in Michigan that was the final step for statehood for the state of Michigan. And so the federal government promised the tribes here, we'll pay a bunch of money. You get to keep some of your lands, you're welcome. And you'll also retain the right to hunt on the lands you've ceded and until we need them later on for settlement. So I'm going to come back to that because that is relevant actually to this very day, and I'll explain why. So you go forward, the United States is becoming a much more powerful country throughout the 1800s. And so if you look at the treaties that were written on the East Coast, they were pretty favorable to tribes, generally speaking. And then as you move west, I guess I'm looking on your screens, if you move west, you see that these treaties now become more and more onerous for tribes. And actually, there have been studies on this that the tribes that fought the hardest militarily against the United States tended to get better deals. And the US actually had a kind of like an actuarial formula that it used to determine how much it was going to pay tribes in these treaties. And that was basically, how much is it going to cost us to fight a war against this tribe? How many annuities will we have to pay out for dead soldiers? And then let's do a discount. And tribe, here's how much we'll pay to buy your land. And then they would put it in these treaties. And so the treaty acquisitions are stretching farther and farther west, and you get to the 1800s. And then the United States decides, man, I'm really tired of dealing with these pesky tribes, right? This is really inconvenient. And the United States House of Representatives passes a resolution that says, no more treaties. No more treaties with tribes. We're not doing any more treaties with tribes. Now, those of you who know your Constitution might remember that the ability to make treaties is a power that the Constitution provides the President and the United States Senate. But there's no role for the House of Representatives in treaty making. And so the US House was tired of being left out of all this Indian policy, so they passed a resolution. They say no more treaties in 1887, I think. And so treaty making stopped after 100 years. And then immediately thereafter, the federal government passes this law known as the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act. And what that does is it says, man, these Indians still have tens of millions of acres of land left and they're not using it. And we need to teach them all to be productive members of society and assimilate just like the rest of us. So we're going to divide up all the reservations into little squares, 160-acre squares, and we're going to allot them. And we're going to assign each allotment to a different family, and that's their land. And whatever's left over, well, that's surplus land, and we'll use that to make states like the state of Oklahoma and sell off to land speculators and what have you. Interestingly enough, if any of you guys have been out west to some of the larger reservations out there, folks from tribal communities out west, you'll know that a lot of them have really memorable or colorful names. I think of the Crow Reservation in Montana. They have last names like Black Eagle. I have a good friend of mine, her last name is White Man Runs Him. And that comes back from an ancestor who was a scout for the US Cavalry. So he was called that White Man Runs Him because his boss was a white man. And that goes back to the Dawes Act, because Indian people, historically, we have clans as our families. We don't have last names, or we didn't. And so that's not how we record property in the United States. So we carved up all these Indian lands, and you got to record them at the county courthouse, right? So if Jim's name, was Black Eagle, well, you can't just say Black Eagle, and then you're not going to know who his kids are. So the government came and they said, Jim, guess what? Your whole family's last name is now Black Eagle. And that's how you get these surnames like this that get passed down. And that was to record these deeds and break up what was left of Indian country. And the real intention was to civilize us and make sure that what was left of our lands got sold off as private property. It turns out that that didn't work very well for Indian people. So we went having a collective Indian ownership of land of over 100 million acres at the start of that, down to about 50 million acres. And in the 1930s, there was a report to Congress saying, you guys, this is really bad, called the Miriam Report. Tribes are faring very poorly. They're getting swindled out of their lands. People are ripping them off. You got to do something about it. So Congress, as part of FDR's New Deal, passed this law called the Indian Reorganization Act. So when you talk to Indian lawyers like myself and use the term IRA, we think of the Indian Reorganization Act, whereas in the public minds, if you're older than me, IRA has a completely different meaning. But we always talk about it as the IRA. And so what the IRA said is no more allotment. It's very bad, very bad. We got to help these tribes. They want to live together. They want to maintain their tribal identity. They want to have control over their lands. They need to acquire lands for their tribal lifestyle. So we're going to pass this law to do it. And we're going to help them write these constitutions that form their own systems of government. And they can reorganize with a government that we recognize under this new law. And they'll be the boss. They'll be the sovereign in charge of their reservations. And so a lot of what we know as tribal governments now, what looks familiar to us, comes from that law in 1934. Well, as happens in this country when Indians are doing all right, it didn't take long for people to say, oh, wait a minute, that's too much. Indians are getting too much. So in the 1950s, the federal government shifted back and they said, we got to quit treating Indians special, and they got to be just like the rest of us. So they adopted this policy in Congress called termination, and it is what it sounds like. Arnold Schwarzenegger turned into law, and the federal government said, we're going to terminate tribes. No such thing as Indian tribes anymore. They got to be just like the rest of us, equal citizens under the law and all that stuff. So Congress passed a number of laws saying, you're not a tribe, you're not a tribe, you're not a tribe. And they would sell off tribal lands and disperse the money to tribal members and say, good luck. And in many cases here in the Midwest, what would happen as part of this is this workforce development type of program where federal agents would come into tribal communities and literally give people one-way bus tickets. Go to Detroit. That was common in Michigan. Go to Detroit and work in the factories, get a union job, and be like the rest of us. No more tribe. You're terminated. And that happened all over the place, and that's why you see a lot of vibrant urban Indian communities in Detroit, Grand Rapids, Milwaukee, Minneapolis. That stems directly from that federal policy in the 1950s. Well, as we saw under allotment, the same thing happened. Tribes fared very poorly under termination. And so in the 1960s, tribes joined the civil rights movement and started asserting rights to treaties, or the rights that we had retained under treaties. So a lot of treaty rights kind of laid dormant for a century. And then in the 1960s, you see in places like Puget Sound, Oregon, Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and here in Michigan, tribes saying, our treaties said we have a right to fish and hunt in the lands that we ceded. We're poor. This is our way of life. We're going to go and fish. We have a legal right to do this. And elsewhere, tribes were asserting their right to have self-government and kind of oust the BIA's influence. And so you get these episodes like Wounded Knee in South Dakota. And then here in Michigan, where tribal members are going out and engaging in commercial fishing. And a lot of times, because this was illegal, they would go out at night. Now, you guys all know the Great Lakes. That's very dangerous. And people died. And then oftentimes they were met on the beaches when they were bringing in their harvest and beat up, had their tires slashed, their cars vandalized, and worse. It was very common for people to bring along a young adult son or daughter, and their job would be to sit in the truck on the beach while mom and dad lifted nets out in the dark. And if you see anybody coming, you flash the lights or honk the horn. And some of my relatives have stories about being left there basically with a 12-gauge loaded 12-gauge shotgun in the truck, and it might be 18 or 19 years old, and dad says, protect yourself if you have to. And so these resulted in court battles kind of across the country, including here in Michigan. And you come forward and the federal government, surprisingly under Richard Nixon and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, said, guys, this whole termination thing with tribes isn't working out. They're doing very badly. This whole thing about assimilation, we got to stop that. So we're in a new era of tribal relations called self-determination. And Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination Act, which said, guess what? Now, I know we did termination and we did allotment, but once again, we want you to be in charge of yourselves, and we're going to help you do that. In all these programs that the federal government is supposed to do as your great father, in Washington, D.C., we'll just give you the money and you do these programs with your own governments. And so that is now the federal policy area that we are in. And that started actually under Richard Nixon, who arguably until Barack Obama became president was the most favorable president to Indian tribes in the history of the United States. And that always strikes people as really confusing or interesting. So where does that leave us today? We have from Southeast Florida with the Miccosukes and Seminoles all the way to literally Barrow, Alaska, and everywhere in between, 578 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There are 12 federally recognized tribes here in Michigan. Some tribes, like the Navajo Nation, have hundreds of thousands of tribal members and very large reservations. Other tribes, like in California, consist of fewer than a dozen tribal members and might have less than 1 acre of land to serve as their homelands, and everywhere in between. Each tribe is unique. Each tribe has its own system of government, its own land base, its own requirements for citizenship, because sovereigns, right? Sovereign governments, sovereign nations have the ability to decide who is a citizen. And so you have tribes like many of the Pueblos in New Mexico, they have very traditional rules about citizenship. Some of them are patrilineal, so you are not a tribal citizen unless your dad was a tribal citizen. And that was actually, there was a case that went to the Supreme Court in the 1970s about that, because somebody said there's no equal treatment under the law because I'm being denied my citizenship in my tribe. Other tribes set their citizenship by blood quantum. Some tribes set their citizenship by tracing your ancestry back to a census 100 years ago, and everywhere in between. Cherokee Nation, which is the largest tribe by membership or citizenship in Oklahoma, has nearly 500,000 tribal members. And a lot of people, you'd walk down the street and say, well, you're Cherokee, you don't look Indian to me. Indians come in all shapes and sizes and colors, and each tribe determines for itself who's a citizen, which is why you can have people from the Southwest who have no tribal membership or citizenship who ethnically look very Indian. They're not enrolled in any tribe, and why you have people with blonde hair and blue eyes who are enrolled as Cherokee Nation citizens. That's up to each tribe to decide that. So tribes have governments. We exercise powers over our own lands. Many tribes, like Bay Mills, have elected governments. We pass laws and ordinances, and we're responsible for taking care of the people under our jurisdiction, both our tribal citizens, as well as people who are visitors to our reservation, or people who are married to tribal members and live on the reservation. We have the same responsibilities and obligations as any other type of government. Unlike the state of Michigan, though, tribes really don't have the ability to levy taxes, because the way the land holdings are, most Indian lands, what you would understand as Indian lands, are actually owned by the United States government, and they are held in what's called a trust, and Indians are the beneficiary of that trust. So the Bay Mills Indian community, if you looked up the deed or property, the title to our properties here, you would see that it's owned by the United States. And so sovereigns cannot tax the property of other sovereigns, so tribes cannot levy property taxes to raise money for our governments. Tribes can do income taxes and sales taxes and stuff like that, but most Indians and tribal on reservations across the country, with some exceptions, are very poor. So that's not going to get you a whole lot of revenues for tribal government. So where does that leave us? Well, we got to run businesses to raise money for tribal governments. And that's where casinos come from. And because we are sovereigns with the power to regulate activities on our own lands, we have the ability to legalize activities like gaming, marijuana, any type of business, own those businesses as governments, and use the revenues from that to fund tribal governments. And so, somebody like me who's in a position of elected leadership in a tribe, a lot of times my job is like being the mayor of a very small town. I have to worry about somebody's septic system isn't working. The street lights are out in their neighborhood. Trash isn't getting picked up. But then we also operate casinos that employ several hundred people. And so you have to, take that, small town mayor hat off and put on businessman hat, and say, how are we going to manage this multi-million-dollar business so that it works for employees, our guests are safe, our contracts with vendors are being followed, and the revenues are flowing to tribal government. But then in the afternoon, you have to take that hat off, and then you have to go and meet with representatives in Washington, D.C., representatives from the state of Michigan, engage in that sovereign to sovereign diplomacy. And so being an elected leader of an Indian tribe is kind of like, the Superman ice cream. You get all the flavors in there, right? You're a small town mayor doing community government stuff. You're doing business stuff. You're doing intertribal and intergovernmental diplomacy. And it's very complex. And I think of a time when I was working in Washington, D.C. at the Department of the Interior, and I was out to happy hour with some colleagues from other parts of the department. And I can't remember exactly what was going on in DC at the time, but we were talking about politics, and myself and a friend, we had made some observations about, what the department should be doing and the political dynamics in town. And I remember one of my friends who worked in a different agency at the department, he was kind of astonished. He was like, wow, you guys know your stuff about politics. And I was laughing because Indian affairs kind of gets treated as, you guys are just the other in the agency, you don't matter. And I was explaining to say, in Indian country, politics is in a lot of communities, politics is your lifeblood. Because if you live in a tribal community where there aren't a lot of jobs and there aren't a lot of economic opportunities, your ability to make your way is contingent upon your ability to influence tribal politics. And some of the most highly skilled politicians I've ever met are high school educated people in Indian country, who are responsible for keeping people in the neighborhoods happy, keeping the governor happy, getting congressmen to do what they have to do, and trying to develop these business relationships. And it is a very dynamic and complex lifestyle, if you will, to work for a tribal government. We have police departments, environmental departments, health agencies. We're just like any government, just very small and often under-resourced. So people come up with really creative solutions to solve problems. So I mentioned, before I stop, I mentioned a while back about treaties and their relevance today. You have to start from the notion, right, that the US Constitution recognizes we can't make a treaty with you unless you're sovereign in the first place, right? And if you're sovereign in the first place, tribes, you have all the powers of a sovereign. You start out with all those powers. Now, we just went through a Supreme Court justice nomination, and we heard about originalism and textualism and federalism, and kind of this legal theory that all in the United States, sovereignty rests with the state governments and local government, and the federal government only has what the Constitution gives it. And that principle is the same when it comes to treaties. Tribes had and have the sovereign powers that we have not given to the United States through treaties. And in our treaty with the federal government, there's my dog, sorry about that. We explicitly reserved in the treaty the right to hunt in our ceded territories. And if you read the treaty, that's what it says, the right to hunt. Well, this was a treaty that was negotiated in English through a translator with there was an asymmetry in the bargaining power. And the courts have said, well, when the tribes agreed to that, they understood hunt to mean harvest fish as well. And so you bring that forward into the 1970s when our people were engaging in fishing and reasserting that right, that was a right that we explicitly kept for ourselves. And so we end up with this lawsuit called the United States versus Michigan, where the federal courts reaffirm that right. And that's why we have tribal fishing in northern Michigan today. That ties directly back to that legal principle in that treaty. And it was part of the bargain for Michigan to become a state. And so we are now, literally this morning actually, engaged in meetings and negotiations with the state of Michigan about how we are going to manage fishing going forward in the upper Great Lakes. And it gets very contentious because oftentimes the state of Michigan says, these are our lakes, right? We're the boss here, we're the sovereign, these are our resources. And we are always there to remind them, well, you wouldn't exist without this promise. And we kept this right for ourselves. And it means something. It's our way of life. But if you read the treaty also, it references the economic importance of the fishery in the Great Lakes. And so this is a right that continues to exist, that we have a real living obligation to take care of and to protect. And as tribal leader of one of the tribes that is a signatory to that treaty, it is my responsibility to make sure that when I leave this job and leave this earth, that the people who come after me have that right still, and that it means something. It's not just a right on paper, that the lakes still have fish in them, still have fish that we can eat and sell. And so that's, when you read in the newspaper about Enbridge and the tribes just, oh, the tribes and their treaty rights, they're always whining about treaty rights. That's what it's about. It is about the fundamental, that acorn, that doctrine of discovery, and the rights that tribes had from the beginning and explicitly kept in a document that was provided for by the US Constitution and upheld by the courts. It means something. If the First Amendment right to practice your religion and engage in free speech means something, our right to fish under our treaties has to mean something too. So I blathered on for a long time. We have 20 minutes or so left, and I would be happy to answer your questions.
Bryan, do you want to take them? We can have people raise hands, or we can have them put them in the chat box.
I think if people just raise their hands, that would work best.
Okay. Who's got a question?
I always have a question.
I had lots. Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
The question that's burning in me isn't so much history as it is given this day. And my question is very specific. I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and in some UU churches at the beginning of their service, they acknowledge whose land it is that our congregation gathers on. And so I would like my church to do that. But then as I'm trying as a white person, growing up socialized white, I'm questioning, is that tokenism? How could that be done in a way that would be respectful long-term?
Well, no, that's a great question. I think, so land acknowledgements are something that are really becoming more of a thing in America. And I think it's always important that people remember, people understand where this comes from. And I think most Native peoples are not here to attempt to relitigate the past, right? But what we do want is for the rules to stop changing. Because I walked you through just the high level overview of how they go back and forth. And whenever Indians do well, it seems like the rules are changed because that's not supposed to happen. And one of the ways that we could do that is to understand where we come from. And I always try to make a point of explaining to people, I love the state of Michigan. I'm really proud of being from here. And it's important to explain to people where the state of Michigan comes from. We wouldn't be a state without that Treaty of 1836. Where does that, what comes with that agreement? What lands are subject to that agreement? Who are the tribes who live here today? And even if you don't have a federally recognized tribe nearby, Bay Mills is very far from, you said you're near Elk Rapids?
The church is in Traverse City,
Okay.
Old Mission Peninsula.
Sure. Yeah, Bay Mills is, we're a 3.5 hour drive from Old Mission Peninsula, but guess what? If I went down to Old Mission Peninsula and cast a hook and line out into the water, it is Bay Mills Indian community that is licensing and regulating my actions, even though I'm very far from home. And it is important, I think, to acknowledge the land and the rights that the tribe have, both morally and legally, because even though our tribal headquarters aren't right there, we still have an interest in it. And so making people aware of that and understanding that is always important. And as long as it's done with sincerity and rooted in reality, in fact, I think it's always appropriate. And when you have an opportunity to learn what we called that place, and learning the language and the name by asking in a respectful way, I think that's great.
Thank you.
Miigwech.
I don't have a question. Well done, Bryan. Miigwech for being here. But I just have more of a statement to kind of add on to what Bryan's saying. And I think more and more with our meetings, we're talking about land acknowledgements. And I think what he's talking about there is a big part of why we need to acknowledge the, those who came first and still support the land and still live on the land and rely on it. It's part of re-educating everybody that we're working with. So I know groundwork has been really good at starting to incorporate land acknowledgements. And I think what you've heard today are some of those reasons why we need to continue that.
I agree. Miigwech, Michelle. And another part too that I just, I want to be careful and respectful of the people who have taught me things in sharing knowledge that I have permission to share. But just generally, indigenous religions around the world are very rarely text-based religions, right? So if you are Catholic, you can be Catholic anywhere. You can take your Bible, your scripture. You can go to Mass in Paris. You can go to Mass in Africa. You can go to Mass in Traverse City. And your religion is portable, right? Because it's text-based. Most indigenous religions are not that way. Most of our religions are place-based religion, and it's also a different approach to religion because most indigenous belief systems are rooted in living where we are and understanding our place in the world. And so when you acknowledge the land, you also do a land acknowledgement. You also acknowledge our way of life, so to speak, which is important because there are places where certain ceremonies can only take place in certain places. And if that place is bulldozed and a skyscraper is put up there, it is not as though you just do that somewhere else with the same effect, right? That part of our belief system is gone. And so land acknowledgements are an important part of acknowledging the importance of the land to who we are as Anishinaabe people.
Diane, you had your hand up.
Yeah, this builds a little bit off of Mary's question. Thank you, Bryan, so much. This is really wonderful. I was wondering if you know of any county commissions or city councils that are doing land acknowledgements? Some models for that.
I see them most often actually at universities.
Mhm.
I'm not, I can tell you they're not doing them around here at Bay Mills. Some of our neighboring governments are less than friendly. So I'm not familiar with any in Northern Michigan that could be a model. I think Seattle, they actually have tribal members on their city council. That would probably be a good place to look. Hey, Dan.
Hey, clean energy question for you. Given the different rules and regulations and your sovereignty on land, what are the challenges and the opportunities you've seen in renewable energy to push projects forward or not?
Well, it's a complex. That's a great question, and it's complex because a lot of the ways. Gosh, we don't have enough time, but a lot of the ways that you finance these projects, right, are with tax credits, and because the land is owned by the federal government itself, it's not taxable to begin with. So you can't have a tax credit when there's no tax there, and that complicates the financing of it. Although that's starting to change. And so you get places out west where tribes have larger reservations, and tribes get engaged as a landlord. Say, we'll give you a great deal on 3,000 acres, that has great solar resources. And so that becomes the incentive. But that solves the development piece, but less the ownership piece. And so getting this all together where you have a project that can be financed on enough land and have the tribe be invested in ownership becomes very complicated. And then of course you have the portability problem of getting the power wheeled off the res onto the grid, and transmission is dealt with these regional utilities and then interstate utilities. And this is a long-winded way to say it's a complicated puzzle. Tribes are starting to figure it out. There are tribes out west that have ownership of very large solar farms and wind farms, but it is these layers of different jurisdictions have made it tricky. And the other part, I didn't have time to get into today, but one of the things that happens when there's successful economic development in Indian country is state governments tend to look at that and say, well, that looks like a big fat tax check for us. And so they try to come in and put taxes on any of these developments, and you're constantly in a battle to try to fend that off as tribes.
Hey, Dan, just to follow up on that, one of the topics that we've agreed as part of this UP Clean Energy Conference series that we wanted to delve deeper into was exactly the question that you just asked. And so we'll give Bryan a lot longer to talk about what he just did in a couple minutes. So, because I think that's a fascinating question. Any others? Questions? Yeah, Jeff. You're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I'm on mute. Well, first, Bryan, thank you so much. This is just a fabulous presentation, and I really appreciate it. My question has to do with young, like say teenage Indians, and I'm wondering about their sense of hope. And I'm wondering, like, a sense of hope that you felt when you were, maybe 15 and looking ahead at the world, compared to what your interpretation is anyway of kind of the sense of hope that a 15-year-old might feel today.
No, I appreciate that. A lot of it depends on where you're at in Indian country. So across Indian country in America, youth suicide rates are just tragically high. And it gets even worse actually if you go into Canada. And I'm not somebody who's well versed in suicide, other than knowing that it's a epidemic of hopelessness often. And but you see these like clusters that come up. There are a lot of tribal communities that struggle with what we call intergenerational trauma, and that's you're carrying the scars of your grandma being shipped off to boarding school and having her relationship with her brothers and sisters and parents just torn to shreds, or maybe your mom or your dad had a sibling who was adopted out, placed into foster care simply because local foster care agencies said, well, you're poor, so you have a bad upbringing, we put you in foster care and you get adopted out of the tribe. So you have these generations of just shredded familial and community relationships, and they get passed down, right? We live with our trauma, and that gets passed down to kids. And then we all know teenagers, that's an emotional time of life anyway. And then you layer that on top of it, your own trauma, your parents' trauma, your siblings, your cousins, your aunties, and it does breed hopelessness in some communities. One of the things that really motivates me to do my job is to build a sense of hope here. When I was, you still hear it today, but when I was growing up, right, you hear your peers talk about wanting to get out. You got to get out, got to get out of here, because it felt like there was nothing here for us. And I see across Indian country now, in a lot of places, the reverse, because Indian people are always called home, and there's just something in you where you want to live in that tribal way of life with your people, and not just with your people, but with your relations, your land, and providing opportunities for our people to do that here, where they don't feel like they have to get out. It's occurring more and more in different tribal communities, but not enough and not quickly enough. But I just want to note on that too. A lot of people. So my dad is not Native, and we have a Finnish background. I'm a Findian, and it's just common up here in the UP. And a lot of people talk about, well, we want to go back to the motherland, right? I want to go to the old world and visit where my family's from, and walk the footsteps of my great grandfathers. And for those of you who have had that experience, that's a powerful experience, right? If you get to, I have a lot of Italian American friends who've gone to Italy and met their distant relatives and walked in the streets of their hometown, and they come back and they know how powerful it is. When I walk out my door here, and in the afternoon I take my dogs for a walk on the lakeshore, I'm doing that. I'm doing that every day. I get that experience, and that's what it's like to be a tribal person in your own lands. And so, and it feels really good. And for me, wanting to make sure that our people feel like that's worth something, and that they can lead fulfilling lives here and have that they don't have to go away to have a job. They don't have to go away to use their talents. If you're, we started a cannabis business, and we have people who are just really enthusiastic about cannabis. Well, if we don't have to stick them in a job digging ditches that makes them miserable, and they can do what's fulfilling to them and then be a part of our people, that's what gives hope. And that's what a lot of us are working for.
We have one last question. We have just a couple more minutes. Go ahead, Mary.
Is there some way that all of us can advocate for more Anishinaabe teachers in public schools?
There are lots of ways. One is to help give to programs that work to keep the language alive, and you guys know Michelle is one of the best. That's one way, and the other two. So it is very difficult for schools here in northern Michigan to find Anishinaabemowin teachers, partially because there aren't enough people who speak fluently, but part of it is the way you learn it isn't through traditional teacher certification programs, right? And so it took a lot of work to get schools and the state school board to say, I know you know how to speak your language, but you don't have that slip of paper from Michigan State University that says you do. But how do we get you accreditation and certification as a teacher to do that? I don't know the answer to that other than to just advocate to policymakers and to advocate to local schools. Because the schools in northern Michigan, we have Native students all across northern Michigan, not just in the communities near reservations. And in creating a market for teachers will create an incentive for people to learn the language and become teachers themselves. And I think that's one way to help it. I'm a policy oriented guy, so that's always my instinct, right? How do we fix a problem? Well, let's have a policy on it and a law. But I think that's one way to advocate.
Thank you so much.
I wish I had a better answer for you. And if anybody has a better answer for me, please tell me.
Thank you. I have to scoot. So thank you
Okay.
so much.
Yeah, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. Bryan, thanks so much. This was really, your perspective was just exactly what I was looking for. So really appreciate that. I know so many of us have still a lot more questions, but that was a great start. Can we kind of continue to ask questions if we have them?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a little bit of time to stick around too. I get my next call's at 1:30. I'm happy to do that, or I can come back, but I just appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys.
Yeah, thanks a ton.
Yeah, I have a meeting I have to jump on to, so I'm going to miss some of the next questions. But Bryan, I just want to say Chimigwech, and this is kind of a personal thing, and I'm getting choked up thinking about it. But I just want to let you know, because we haven't had a chance to talk personally, how proud I am of you and everything you've accomplished. Bryan was still a young person when I was charged by a former chairman to start the Recreation and Health Promotion Department, myself and another gentleman. And I remember Bryan and all his sibs and friends and cousins coming to the gym playing basketball all the time. And it's just been awesome watching you become the man that you are. And I follow you now, so I think it's great. And thank you so much for continuing to share and keep that wisdom flowing.
I appreciate that, Miigwech, Michelle.
Yep.
I wish I had spent more time getting better at basketball.
Well, when you have to worry about me jumping into the game, there's just no hope for anybody that way.